Live from Brussels, it's ZN Live. Very excited to be back after being in Copenhagen earlier this week. And today we have a guest, Wouter, who is a very experienced public affairs professional. He's the actual Secretary General of the European Fruit Juice Association. He's worked on many different industries with extensive experience, and he's going to share some of his insights on sustainability. But he's also a great believer in the importance of education and learning, especially in public affairs. And he is very active in the association world, where he actually met with Leora, and we are going to be talking in Geneva later on. So, Wouter, tell us a bit about why you believe that organizations like Association World, which brings professionals together, is important, and why did you get involved?
Yeah, thanks, Philippe, also for the invitation and from this very sunny Brussels at the end. Well, you have already mentioned it in your introduction. It's all about the learning process, and it's all about sharing best practices in between amongst peers. It's where you get together. Brussels is all about professional associations, and we have that sort of professional associations not only to defend certain interests, but also to bring people together. And it's when you bring people together that you have a greater mindset, a better insight. And when you can learn from each other, mistakes is maybe a bad word, but at least from mishappenings, you can improve yourself much better.
Yeah, I agree. Actually, I think there are quite a few quotes saying that you learn far more from failure than from success. I think it's all about digesting trial and error and trying to build from that. We have Sebastian Rodriguez saying happy Friday to everyone. So we will say the same to you, Sebastian. Now, I want to go to one of your kind of areas that I believe you're very interested in, which is sustainability and the Green Deal. Now, this is a topic that's been obviously a huge part of the Brussels agenda. But at the same time, first of all, do you think that it's still something that's sufficiently discussed at a high level? Because with all the other things, energy crisis, Ukraine, sometimes the agenda gets dropped. And how do you believe that communicators and public affairs professionals can work to make those topics come forward? So tell us a bit about your views on sustainability.
Well, indeed, there were so many challenges in the last 2 years where that political agenda, when von der Leyen started, has now dropped a bit in the attention field, whilst it is really one of the core aspects for the future of the world, for the future of the coming generations and so on. So I'm a firm believer that we need to indeed level up back again the whole communication about the Green Deal, about sustainability. And communication is so essential, and this digital communication leaves us a huge opportunity to have an enormous interactivity and to beef up the level of the communication, to have really a constant dialogue with many more people than before, than for instance, in a traditional communication way with a paper communication and so on. So this digital possibility enlarges the public to discuss about sustainability, and I'm also myself personally a firm believer. That's why I'm now working on a side track is starting a sustainable agriculture project in Zambia, because that's where also my partner comes from, and we see also there the knowledge of this sustainability is not there, whilst it is one of the core continents, Africa, where we should be working on sustainability, where we should be helping to do the education. And what I have seen there when I was there recently, 2 weeks ago, digital is all available with the young generation. So you have a digital tool which is already there, but not yet the knowledge. So if we can do digital communication to that generation about the importance of sustainability, I think we have a huge future there also.
Yeah, I agree. I think digital is a fundamental tool for exchange and learning and exchange of information. And that's something that you're very active on, which is education. And actually, we already had a question on an upcoming event.
I do indeed, because I know that you are one of the inspirations behind something new and an event with a fantastic name, which I am going to attempt to pronounce now, which is, it's fantastic. And Kai, I applaud you if you're watching for the name. That is the first European Conference of Association, Public Affairs and Advocacy Professionals, organized by Association World, by Inspired, as I said, by you. So why did you come up with this fantastic event with this fantastic name?
Yeah, well, it was a bit out of experience. I have two youngsters here in the office of the European Fruit Juice Associations. They have spent their internship remotely. From one was from the European Parliament, the other one was from the European Commission. Came to the team here at Fruit Juices, and at that moment, the big dossiers started. And the big dossiers were the packaging and packaging waste regulation, with a huge impact for the industry, as well as the fruit juice directive. It's a bit technical, but there we needed to do a lot of public affairs. And for them, never had that experience in public affairs. It was a huge start. It's a kickstart for them. And that's what and they both had, of course, their education in political science and so on. But then I saw that there was a huge lack of knowledge on what is public affairs exactly, how to start with elaborating about a public affairs strategy, how to implement public affairs. And they are fantastic, a young generation, so they can pick up the phone. But also that was not happening. So you really have to think about how can we make sure that MEPs are listening to you, and just sending an email like they were used to, or by Instagram or WhatsApp, is not going to connect people to you. You really have to talk to them, have to pick up the phone, but that's all a part of the strategy. So out of that experience, and out of my own experience, because when I started 30 years ago in public affairs, the real public affairs tool was going to have lunch at 12 o'clock and ending that lunch around 5. And that was a little network that we had from some people from the commission. The parliament at that time didn't play any role. So that was my training, my mentorship was through this whole aspect was a very traditional approach to public affairs. But then Corona kicked in, and all this network was not available anymore. You couldn't go out, you couldn't go to congresses, and that's also where I saw then a huge lack of my own insight on how to apply digital advocacy. And so the education is not only for myself, but it's for everybody, is to sit together to be trained on how to approach digital public affairs.
And actually, you mentioned the importance of learning and training. How would you define what is public affairs, actually? In the simplest way, if I was prompting ChatGPT, I would say, tell it like I was a 10-year-old with a relatively very low grasp of the word. What does it mean?
Oh, there are thousands of indeed simple indications, but for me, public affairs is just being a good salesperson of your ideas, concepts, or positions.
To the governments and
To
institutions?
the stakeholders that need to be informed about your position, that needs to be getting interested in your position, and at the end will help to shape legislation.
Now, you talked about the COVID experience of remote work. As you know, at ZN, we've embraced that, and we've actually made that part of our core capabilities, which is to not just to work remotely, but to build tools and training and an approach to make that work. What has your experience, obviously coming from a traditional public affairs background, been, and how do you think it's changed the Brussels, the way people do public affairs?
Yeah, it has changed indeed enormously. The previous approach, as you just mentioned, is this traditional approach of one-to-one meetings, and that will still stay very valid. But it's much more because those legislators are impacted by a lot of information sources, worldwide information sources through social media, and that's where then, of course, this digital public affairs kicks in, because you have to approach also that aspect of public perception. They are part of the public, or a public institution perception. And this cannot be done by one-to-one. You need to get a dialogue suddenly with not one person, but with 100 persons at the same time. And so this is something where we need a completely different approach. You need to be setting a strategy also on how to communicate. If you have, like we are now having a one-to-one communication, okay, I can have some preparation, but it is a fluent talk. But whilst you have this communication on a digital written form, which always stays there, it's completely different. You cannot just have out of the blue starting a dialogue with no concept of what you're going to say, no concept of which message you want to convey to the other person, no concept on how to maybe just when there is a huge discussion, a wrong discussion, how to foster that discussion and so on. So it's much more being prepared for that sort of aspect of communication.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there is a very exaggerated image of the old traditional public affairs, which is men in smoke-filled rooms with cigars doing deals behind the scenes, and that I would say is, of course, everybody doesn't smoke, but the point is, in my view, one of the problems Brussels, the European project, and the institutions have had is that type of lobbying, which is one-on-one, secretive, not public, is actually, there is a certain amount of negativity and toxicity about that. Whereas if you're doing things on social media, it forces transparency. I think not only it forces you to have a public communication, you can't keep your secrets, you can't tell people something that you don't want anyone else to know. And the second thing is it opens the conversation to people who are not in Brussels, or people who are anywhere in the world. Now, what do you feel about those as, I would say, morally good results of the move towards transparency? Because I don't think it's good to have a small elite in Brussels making decisions for 450 million citizens. What do you think about that? Those forced changes?
The recent happenings with Qatargate has shown that sort of lobbying is not of this world anymore. You have seen that it's even counterproductive. It has had a huge impact even on the normal correct lobby persons, because now everybody suddenly becomes scared of even having a normal talk with you, or having a lunch with you, because that sword of Damocles there on Qatar gates is really on us, and transparency is really essential. And I think the whole transparency register obligation is really required. But still, on one-on-one communication or networking doesn't mean that you're not transparent. There are rules also for people from Commission that are meeting. They have to be open. They have to report about it. And it's also sometimes helping, because if you have a very technical dossier, you can't have this in a social media dialogue. It is too complex. It's like with the GMO dossier, then suddenly emotions kick in and not technicalities, and the ratio is gone. And once emotions kick in, and that goes very quickly with social media, because there's always a public perception, there's always a public outrage, and then your dossier is completely lost. So for rather technical dossiers, of course, I think that sort of traditional public affairs plays a more important role. If it is about bigger public concern dossiers, then you should have it open, because the impact of that public concern, of course, is much bigger, and everybody should have its voice in it.
Yeah, and I think that the more we learn to open the conversation to the public, and everyone in the public, of course, is not interested in a technical conversation about a directive, but I think it's the responsibility of the institutions and the stakeholders to actually explain why they're doing what they're doing, what the point is, and to trust people that in the end they have to have the difficult conversation about those outcomes in order to get the results they want. So I think we all have to learn to be better, more transparent communicators using those tools to kind of open up this conversation to people who might disagree, might have very different perspectives than us.
But if that would work really very good, then we wouldn't have had Brexit. And that's the whole. That's the whole aspect. Is how to explain certain things. And indeed, no, and you're right, Philip. I'm fully following also your concept is that we have to be open and transparent and so on. But certain aspects, of course, you need such a good communicator, and I think that's also what we have to learn. And we really need a good education in communicating. You see it also in national politics, where politicians are not good communicators. We see it with science when there is something happening in food safety, where also the scientists are not good communicators. So the role of education in communication is so essential to make difficult, complex communication and easy to understand communication. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, one of the many factors behind Brexit, in my opinion, I'm going to the UK next week, so I'll be just enjoying the virtues of having a more complicated trip. But basically, I think that there was a real lack of passionate making the case for Europe from the mainstream British politicians. And I think that's one of the main reasons there was a much stronger communication from the Brexiteers than from the pro Europeans. They didn't tell a compelling story because they didn't find the right arguments. And I think that's one of, that would have definitely made a difference in the percentages. Now, with these changes, what you said, you talked about these young people that have joined your organization. A lot of the people watching ZM Live are actually interns, hyperlearners, or young people in Brussels. So what is your advice to them, about how they should start their career today? What do you think they need to think about? What skills do they need? What's your advice to them?
Well, they have everything already in their hands. They just have to learn how to use it, because it's a fantastic generation. Yes, if I was with my computer or with my mobile phone, I still have sometimes to ask how to use certain tools in that mobile. They have everything, but one of the things is how to use it, when to use it, be open to be educated upon it. It's never too late to learn things, even if you think you have already gone through a learning process. Every time being open and curious to learn, and be well prepared. As I said at the start, there's never a dialogue in public affairs that is not being prepared very well, and take the time to be prepared for that one.
So the Scouts adage: be prepared and keep learning. I think, and these are two things that, by the way, very much completely agree with at ZN. And I think it's especially as we get older and wiser, to remind yourself that you still have a lot to learn, that you're going to make mistakes, that you're going to misunderstand certain things. We have a comment from Kai Troll saying we need more best practices from NEPs and their experiences with associations about positive approaches. Any thoughts on Kai's comment, Wouter? Wouter?
MEPs are also politicians, so always they need, of course, as I said, politicians need to learn how to communicate also. And I think it was Margaret Thatcher saying that democracy is overrated. I'm not going to say it again, but it's a part is that a lot of politicians only look to a political term of 4 years and not beyond. And so best practices is always looking ahead of maybe 10, 20 years. And it's true, if you have that sort of politicians that are willing to look very long term, then that's indeed something that we need to cherish and work with it.
Excellent. Okay, so now we have time for some recommendations. So, Wouter, we're going to start with you. What are your recommendations for our viewers?
Recommendations on communication
Podcast.
Is always, or in general, being passionate. I'm very passionate. Always being transparent and just be yourself.
And do you have any podcasts or books do you have any podcasts or books to recommend to our viewers?
Well, I have been reading that Hitendra's book on mastering your inner self. That's where you have to start. I had a talk also today with Martin here in the office, and saying how can you do it to be so calm all the time? It's just mastering your inner self. You have to put things sometimes aside and think about the importance of life, and that is sometimes much more than what is happening around you.
Excellent. It reminds me of the emotional intelligence on positive psychology by Martin Seligman, which has a lot about emotional understanding and then kind of learning to slow down certain things. Leah, what are your recommendations for our viewers this week?
Yes, I have a lot to share with our viewers, whoever is still left at this point in the show. I want to start with the Evolving Leader podcast. It's a great podcast with a lot of guests from different fields, business, neuroscience, psychology. And it's a really good podcast if you want to get better. I'm doing a lot of self-reflection, a lot of reflection these days. And one of the guests was actually also the host, one of the hosts of the podcast, and his name is Scott Allender. And he was talking about his book, bit of self-promotion, but actually quite interesting. And his book is called and I hope I'm not mispronouncing this, the Enneagram of Emotional Intelligence. Because he was explaining on the podcast, and then I picked up the book as well, or actually downloaded it to my Kindle, which is easier. And he was saying, yeah, there's a lot of people, especially people who think that they know, are quite self-reflective. But then, when you think what your weaknesses are, it's actually really difficult to change. And he feels like that with this Enneagram, he found the solution to this problem. So he's they have categorized people in 9 different types, and behind all those weaknesses, which he's then highlighted, he's identified the fears. And so once you know what the fear is, you can then address the fear. Now, as a daughter, I have to be honest, of psychoanalysts, I was a little bit skeptical because I believe more in, the proper psychology and, going to psychoanalysis. But it is actually really, really interesting. So, for example, type 1 is the perfectionist who, you can often suffer under their anger because they're angry that you are not good enough. They're angry with themselves because nothing they ever do is good enough in their own eyes. But below that is a lot of fear of making mistakes, of not being adequate themselves. And so once they address, okay, where does that fear come from? How can I address it? They can stop just, being, this perfectionist or hiding behind this perfectionist type. And so there are 9 different types. And when you read the book, you will easily find which ones are more you, which ones are absolutely not you. So there's also the peacemaker, for example, who avoids any type of conflict, but what's behind that? So really quite interesting. So maybe listen to the podcast, and if the podcast, this is, I think, the one before last, or the second before last. And if you think that that's an interesting concept, then maybe pick up the book and improve yourself, because we all constantly need to improve ourselves. And then the other thing that I would recommend is a book from someone in our ZN network, and it's called Sing Memory by Makana Iyer. And this is just an amazing, amazing, beautiful book, which I only say because I've read a Wall Street Journal article about it, because it only just came out. So I haven't read it yet, but I know it's amazing because the concept is amazing. It's about music in the Holocaust, in the Shoah. So this is about a person who's actually saved the music that was created during the concentration camps. And it was actually a tool that the Nazis used, music, to suppress people. They made people march and on horrible music. But at the same time, at sort of small moments, people also used it to uplift themselves. And most of these people did not survive. But there was a Polish person, if I'm not mistaken, who tried to save and write down all the music, and then a lot of this music is now saved in the Holocaust Museum in the United States. Anyway, it's a tremendously interesting story that Makana has taken 4 years to write down. And I think it's a very powerful emotional story, and one that I hadn't heard about, and I know a lot about this time in history. So I think definitely pick that up, support Makana, who spent so much time and effort in creating this. Phil, what are your recommendations for the week?
So my recommendation is actually it's a book by Ray Dalio, who wrote this. Actually, that he wrote several books, but a big one called Principles. And this is actually like a kid's version of it, or like a simplified version. And I mean, it's interestingly. So I read the bigger book, but this is actually a very good summary. And sometimes, it doesn't have to be that complicated to convey very simple but powerful ideas. It's all about learning, trial and error, adjusting yourself to accepting reality, and then understanding what you can do. And then, I mean, some very simple principles, but at the same time, I think very well explained. And if you want to continue your journey with Ray Dalio, he's now got this whole theory of economic change, which goes into very specific technical details. So that's probably a bit, I'm still struggling to get through that one. But the principles, I think, is good. There's a YouTube channel with a lot of these, the little video animation, which I think does quite a good job. So with that, I think that's all we have time for. Wouter, thank you so much for coming on the show. Looking forward to continuing our conversation online and to seeing you in Geneva, and maybe before at the Public Affairs First Conference from...
It's at the end of June.
Okay, at the end of June. More information, watch the space. That was ZN Live for you. Have a fantastic, warm and sunny weekend in Brussels. Bye, everyone.
Enjoy the holiday.